Perhaps the most groundbreaking discovery in the history of medicine was the development of penicillin, a substance which upon its discovery was called a true miracle. Finally, a drug had been found which could cure people of the most dreaded infections. And although several pathogenic bacteria became resistant to penicillin, new types of antibiotics were found to suppress these illnesses. However, due to abuse and an overconsumption of penicillin, many pathogenic bacteria soon outwitted the miracle drug. Resistant bacteria are gaining ground, and in the meanwhile, the development of new medicines has practically come to a halt.
Allied casualties in Normandy received the most expert medical care science can provide. Two modern treatments, penicillin and blood transfusion, have cheated death in thousands of cases. Gangrene, from which millions have perished in past wars, has been conquered by the miracle of penicillin. Thousands of men, thanks to penicillin, will come home to their thankful families. The whole world of peace to come will reap the benefits of this great wartime medical discovery. Science has won another victory over death.
Throughout most of human history, infectious germs have caused death and destruction. For centuries, deadly diseases such as the plague, tuberculosis and gangrene had befallen people all over the world, in the countryside, in cities and on the battlefield.
If we go back to 100 years, to the mid-19th century, many more soldiers died of infection than died directly from the explosions of cannons. By World War I, already the system was changing because there was a process for handling injured soldiers. But you couldn't cure infection. You could prevent it by bandaging soldiers quickly, but often they suffered gangrene and many soldiers died from infection.
Until the beginning of the 20th century, the risk of infection had made it difficult to treat many types of diseases.
There were significant problems with infections that really limited a lot of what we could do in medicine. For example, staph infections caused significant infections in children and newborns. They contaminated wounds. So, for example, when you were in an automobile accident, there was always this great concern that there would be infection. And so in some cases, you'd almost rather amputate the leg than take the risk that the infection would take off.
The hunt for medicine that can cure dreaded diseases such as syphilis, gonorrhea and pneumonia has been going on since the beginning of civilization. But it was not until the end of the 19th century that the discovery of how infectious diseases are spread came about.
It was a big turning point that it was discovered that single microbes would cause the disease. And the thought was there that if we could find what was then called by Paul Ehrlich a magic bullet, something that would enter the body and seek out the invaders, namely the bacteria, then we could cure the patient without harming the patient.
At the beginning of the 20th century, German doctor Paul Ehrlich developed a substance similar to arsenic with which to treat patients with syphilis. However, this proved to be toxic and had strong side effects. Then, in 1928, Scottish doctor Alexander Fleming accidentally stumbled upon a completely new medicine. One day, whilst working with bacterial cultures, Fleming discovered a spot of mould. It wasn't unusual for petri dishes to be polluted by fungus, but the odd thing was that the bacteria around the mould had disappeared. Fleming found this fungus, known as penicillin, could prevent the growth of dangerous bacteria such as staphylococci and anthrax. Experiments on rabbits showed that penicillin was apparently harmless, but Fleming didn't succeed in proving that the substance had a curative effect on people. This happened over 13 years later, and penicillin was then mass-produced in the United States.
Through mass production methods, America is continually increasing its output of penicillin, the new drug that effects almost miraculous cures. The liquid medium in these bottles will grow the mold that forms penicillin. All penicillin produced is used by the Allied fighting forces. The liquid now charged with penicillin is poured from the bottles. Turned into a powder, it is ready for use.
The manufacture of penicillin had great significance during World War II. On the cover of Time magazine in May 1944, it said that Fleming's medicine would save more lives than war could spend. Penicillin was widely used to save the lives of soldiers suffering from septicemia, but also to cure different types of diseases among soldiers.
Every time there's a war, the venereal disease rate takes a jump. It's bad enough in peacetime, but now it's like a forest fire. No organization of saboteurs could do half this damage to our army.
One of the characteristic diseases of soldiers are sexually transmitted diseases. If you imagine Europe in 1945, starving women, millions of soldiers, young men, separated from their girlfriends, from their wives, there was the beginning of a terrible syphilis epidemic.
We average 30 venereal disease cases each year out of every 1,000 men in uniform. That means 300,000 men put out of action each year in a 10 million men army. Think of that, 300,000 casualties without even a battle.
You could reasonably say, and I believe this to be sure, that had there not been penicillin, then syphilis would have been for Europe what AIDS later became for Africa. And that memory of this wonder drug is very important in understanding why later we came to assume that penicillin would solve every one of our problems.
In the post-war era, a long line of new antibiotics that could cure many major diseases was developed. Streptomycin, for example, cures tuberculosis, and tetracycline is used to treat pneumonia. In just under 30 years, the mortality rate of young patients suffering from pneumonia fell tenfold.
When antibiotics were introduced, there was a sharp decline in the loss of life and hospitalization of patients with pneumonias, urinary tract infections, skin infections. I think it had an enormous effect. And I think this is why many in the clinical medicine field believe that antibiotics are one of the treasures that we have in our armamentarium to treat patients.
Of course, then it is used not just for the gravely ill, but for people suffering those irritating illnesses which we have every day. The irritating infections, the sore throats, the sore fingers. And of course, maybe even, we think these will not only make my life longer, but also happier.
In fact, you could get penicillin in face creams. You could get it in cosmetics. And the effect of that, of course, was if you had a small infection, it would work. But basically, the whole idea that was conceived was that this was a miracle drug for many different ailments.
In the late 1940s, a new property of antibiotics was discovered which had great influence on the production of pigs, chickens and other livestock.
One of the manufacturers of a tetracycline, which comes from a soil organism, had this huge pounds and pounds and pounds of the protein left over from the organism after they had extracted their tetracycline. And they wondered if it couldn't be put to some use, such as being used as feed for chickens and other animals. When they added this carcasses of bacteria to the normal feed, they found that the animals grew bigger for less feed. And the discoverers thought they had found a new vitamin.
Rather early on, they realized that it was actually the fact that there was still antibiotics left in this product that made the animals grow faster. And it was then realized that if they just added low amounts, fairly low amounts of antibiotics to the feed throughout the life of the animal, it would grow faster than would otherwise be the case. So antibiotics very quickly became a production tool, not a medicine. It was not even talked about or seen as a medicine.
It changed the industry overnight. Animal producers worldwide began to seek out antibiotics to add back to the feed or buy it already in it. And no one was particularly concerned about what it might be doing outside the animal.
In the 1950s, the sales of antibiotics became big business, and thousands of tons were used to combat disease. And in livestock, it was used as a growth promoter. The miracle drug, however, began to have its drawbacks.
Fairly soon after their introduction, there was a small cloud on the horizon in that initially staphylococci, which were one of the bacteria, one of the groups of bacteria that one was really concerned about in terms of serious wounds and wound infections, began to show resistance to penicillin.
Pathogenic bacteria could apparently become resistant to penicillin. Back in 1945, in the New York Times, Alexander Fleming warned against the uncontrolled use of penicillin, and also pointed out that taking too small a dose made a good breeding ground, as bacteria could survive small doses. No one took notice of Fleming's warning, and it wasn't until the 1960s that people realized the miracle drug could fail.
Late in 1967, there was a small outbreak of an E. coli in the children's wards in a hospital in northeast of England in Middlesbrough. 11 children died. Almost all of them very weak. They had been born prematurely. And as far as the medical profession was concerned, this was not either unusual or terrifying. It was disturbing because the E. coli which killed these children was resistant to antibiotics. And the press in 1967 realized the public did not know that children were dying in British hospitals of E. coli. This became a terrible scandal, and E.S. Anderson, a very active scientist within the public health laboratory, warned that it was conceivable, he couldn't prove it, but it was possible that the resistance which E. coli had acquired had been developed in animals. So that here was an example, possibly a warning of a much worse epidemic to come.
Due to public concern, the British Parliament set up a committee to investigate whether the use of antibiotics in livestock could increase the growth of resistant pathogenic bacteria.
The Swan Committee came up with some very bold conclusions that animals were a source of resistant bacterial infections in humans, and that the use of antibiotics in the animals did make the bacteria in the animals resistant. So they actually claimed and to some extent proved a link between the use of antibiotics in animals and resistant bacteria in humans.
The Swan Committee's recommendations brought about a ban, first in England and later in other European countries. In husbandry, 4 different types of antibiotics were banned, as they're vital in combating human diseases. But the use of other types of antibiotics as growth promoters in livestock continued to rise. In the early 1970s, more and more resistant bacteria types were found. The aggressive Staphylococcus had long since survived penicillin, but up until then, new types of antibiotics had managed to suppress this most dangerous bacteria.
By the time I received my medical training in the early 1970s, there was general acceptance that one never used penicillin for staphylococci. One would occasionally get a patient who came in from the community with a staphylococcal infection that was penicillin sensitive. But that was always something, you know, that was remarkable, that you would comment on. Oh, look, we got an old staphylococci strain that, you know, is still pen sensitive. But we had another drug that was you know, related to the original penicillin design, and so consequently people didn't think too much about it.
But there were grounds for concern, for in the 1970s, diseases which previously had been partly suppressed returned. The number of cases of tuberculosis began to rise, and gonorrhea could no longer be cured by many types of antibiotics. Many pathogenic bacteria began to show signs of multi-resistance.
If you have a community of bacteria of which one or two have picked up a resistance trait, and you add the antibiotic, only those with the resistance will survive, and the next thing you know, you have a community of resistant bacteria. And yeah, they are kind of trading weapons. It's almost, you know, like trading baseball cards in which you give me yours, I'll give you yours, but often they don't lose the one they give. They just make another copy and give it to a next bacterium. There's no purpose in it. I mean, this is all events that are happening, but you're talking about millions of bacteria, you know, sitting on the space of the tip of a pin. They're very close together. They can exchange lots of things. And then they separate out, grow again, and if they're confronted with an antibiotic, they'll survive if they're resistant, and they'll die if they don't.
One of the most dreaded bacteria, the golden Staphylococcus aureus, had also become multi-resistant. For several years, Staphylococcus aureus was resistant to penicillin, but now the bacteria could not be suppressed by penicillin's successor, methicillin. MRSA, or the superbug as it's also called, is dreaded in every hospital because it can spread infection during operations and thereby disrupt patient treatment.
You have patients who go in for what should have something they look forward to, what should be a hip surgery which will let them walk again with ease, and instead they emerge, you know, months later after, you know, months of antibiotics, hospitalization, therapy, with a totally dysfunctional joint and complete disability. I mean, what we see is that these are devastating infections, and the increasing problems with treating them can, particularly for individual patients, can be devastating.
On top of a motorcycle accident, MRSA is something Bob Rice really didn't need.
The germ also caused infections in other areas on many of these sites where we've had what we call the donor sites for plastic surgery, plus other open areas, and including the intravenous access site that he needed so he could receive fluids and drugs. And he got an infection on what we call a central line, which is placed up here into one of the large veins. And then he developed infection in his bloodstream from that required ongoing and quite prolonged antibiotics.
Roger Pudney was not so lucky. An abscess in one leg from a suspected spider bite changed his life for the worse. For 6 months, he was isolated and pumped full of antibiotics. But Roger Pudney lost the fight. The only recourse was amputation.
MRSA bacteria quickly spread round the world, much to the concern of health authorities, as there was now a diminishing number of new types of antibiotics which could substitute previous ones. The drug industry had practically given up on finding new types of antibiotics.
It's risky. I mean, they have already looked very hard without finding anyone, so the chance that they are going to find something very effective is not as high as it was in the past. And also, even if they find a drug, getting it approved is a very lengthy and very costly process that also has a very high risk of not leading to a product that goes to market at the end of the day. So industry is prone to go in other direction where there is more chance of making a profit.
The dreaded multi-resistant MRSA could still be wiped out by one antibiotic, vancomycin, which is one of medical science's last big guns to be fired at advancing bacteria. Vancomycin, however, also had drawbacks when treating another bacteria strain, namely the less aggressive Enterococcus bacteria vancomycin-resistant enterococci, or VRE.
We picked up the first strain of VRE in 1989, and we sort of thought, you know, again, when these things show up as sort of an oddity, you know, the director of the clinical microbiology laboratory called me up and said, you know, guess what we found? It was sort of exciting, fun, novel, and we didn't think that much about it. But then all of a sudden, you know, over the next year or two, we started seeing more of them, and more of them, and more of them. And it stopped being a novelty and started to become a very serious medical problem.
Up to this time, vancomycin was beginning to be used to treat the Staph aureus, which was resistant to most other antibiotics. So it was a life-saving antibiotic. So now you see another bacterium carrying vancomycin resistance. That was not good. And I can remember that there were hospitals that had the problem, but many that did not. But by the mid-1990s, virtually every hospital had VRE.
We had deaths in this hospital due to vancomycin-resistant enterococci. Deaths where if the patient had been infected with a susceptible enterococci, we could have saved them. These were patients who we had done horrendous things to, in the sense of, you know, these were patients who had had cancer chemotherapy or a bone marrow transplant or something similar. But again, we had done the bone marrow transplant with the assumption that we could always treat whatever infection resulted. And now suddenly we can no longer give patients that reassurance. We can no longer tell them, don't worry if you become infected, we can treat it. And so we had deaths.
In just a few years, VRE bacteria were widespread. A study of American hospitals in 1989 showed that under 0.5% of bacteria were resistant, a figure which would rise 4 years later to an astounding 10%. The spread of VRE caused much concern, even more so when Danish studies showed that VRE bacteria developed during pig and chicken production by a growth promoter that's related to vancomycin. So, resistant bacteria in animals were ruining the effect of a vital drug for humans.
The use of epoparsin did select for vancomycin-resistant enterococci in swine production and in poultry production. And we proved that resistance genes that encode resistance in the bacteria were the same in those animals that could be found in the food and in the humans. And we also showed that resistant enterococci could transmit from animals to food and most likely also to humans.
The Danish studies resulted in a ban by the European Union. First, avoparsin was banned in 1996, and during the next 10 years, all growth promoters were similarly banned. Nevertheless, the development of resistant bacteria didn't stop, which for hospitals proved to be a grave problem. The American health authorities estimated that 1 in every 20 patients became infected by pathogenic bacteria whilst in hospital. Resistant bacteria quickly spread in countries where antibiotics were administered without doctor consultation, and in countries where antibiotics were prescription drugs, patients pressured doctors to prescribe antibiotics even when it wasn't necessary. The World Health Organization estimated that in the treating of bronchial infections, up to 80% of antibiotic use was completely unnecessary.
Overuse and misuse does no purpose therapeutically. And all it does is recruit more resistance. Treat the patient, get him well, that's it. But if you use it for 5 times more than it's needed, or you use it when there's a cold virus and there's no bacterium, it's a misuse that does have an impact, because you wipe out the susceptible kinds of bacteria and you allow the resistant ones to take over.
Resistant pathogenic bacteria has recently been classified as one of the world's 3 greatest health problems. As the World Health Organization states, the pipeline of new drugs is running dry. Today, old diseases are re-emerging with a vengeance. Tuberculosis, for instance, is now one of the world's biggest killers, with over 2 million people dying from it every year, and with some of them dying of a new multi-resistant tuberculosis bacteria.
We think that there are about 500,000 multi-drug resistant TB cases every year around the world, and the absolute most difficult areas is the countries of the former Soviet Union. The problem is MDR-TB in prisons, and one of the reasons is that prisoners are malnourished, they are vulnerable, they may have HIV, so they are vulnerable to get TB. Prisons are overcrowded. I mean, people live in so small areas, so they have to sleep in shifts, and that means that if someone has MDR-TB, it's transmitted very rapidly to others. So the prisons in these countries have really been the source of the MDR-TB epidemic. The situation is really, really scary in the former Soviet Union, and also places in China where the rates are very, very high. But we must be careful all around the world, because TB doesn't stop at borders.
For the last 50 years, the age of antibiotics, we have had, if you will, a free ride. It's been wonderful. And what will happen is that we will be moving into what has been termed the post-antibiotic era, where suddenly we go back to the way we were in the 1920s and 1930s, where infection was the killer.
Finding new antibiotics is not easy. That companies that could do it are not doing it. And so as resistance gets worse, new drugs are lagging behind. That makes the problem even worse.
The concern that I have is that while today I may be telling you we're hanging by our fingernails, 5 years from now, I may be telling you, I'm not hanging on anymore. Suddenly, I have microorganisms which are not able to be treated with that one last antibiotic that I have left.